Everyone that watches this channel knows that I absolutely love Festool. Pretty much every tool in my shop is covered in green and navy blue, and while these are certainly fun to use on all of my projects, the Systainers that come in can actually be a hindrance to my workspace.
Having Systainers is great. The rigid and interconnected design protect the tools within and lend to organizing the mobile workspace. However, once you start collecting more than a few like I have, managing the Systainer pile can get a little overwhelming in static spaces.
While there are plenty of really basic storage solutions out there for Systainers, most of them didn't have the functionality that I needed or wanted for my workspace. So I decided to design my own.
There were a few features this design needed: a large work surface, primary and secondary storage capabilities, ground clearance for my ShotBot vacuum, and lastly, an aesthetic appeal without breaking the bank. Most of these features were absent from traditional storage designs I found on other websites and community groups. They were either too large or too small, and I needed something that was seemingly right in the middle of these solutions that simply didn't stack up. I wanted a design that closely matched the surface area of my primary workbench, the Festool MFT3. Since the MFT has been the heart of my workshop for years now, I wanted the bench to roughly mirror those dimensions. This gives me plenty of width and depth to work on, plus it opens up the opportunity for expanding my maker tools like laser cutters, small CNCs, and 3D printers. Secondly, I wanted this to double as a storage area for my Systainers that I don't use often, as well as a drawer space for the ones I use frequently. I can keep less used tools and Systainers at the bottom and then utilize the SysAZ drawers in the front for the tools I use most often. With a shop my size, design and space efficiency is a must. I achieve this by keeping all surfaces around the same height, maximizing the viewable floor space, and keeping most bulky items below the middle of the walls. Having the SysBEnch mounted directly to the wall gives headroom for my automated vacuum to keep my entire floor dust-free and clean.
As everyone knows, lumber prices continue to stay high, so I needed to find a solution that gave me the most bang for my buck when it comes to materials. Thankfully, I was able to narrow down the materials needed for one SysBEnch to 2 sheets of 18mm plywood.
Lastly, I wanted to have a nice aesthetic appeal. The angled panels conceal the contents from the side, while the depth of the lower space doesn't draw the eye. I can stand at each bench with plenty of legroom and even have a place to prop my feet. When thinking about the simplicity of the overall design, it needed to be easy to make as well. As you can see here, I cut both sheets of plywood at the same time. As detailed in my plans, I've divided the panels into 3 major cut groups. This ensures consistency on dimension cuts, and it takes less time to cut all the pieces. The first step in this process was to clean off the factory edges and to make all the corners square. In most cases, squaring off the entire sheet isn't necessary. However, multiple corners will be used as references for the panel groups, so it was a must for this process. The first panel group I cut are for the sides and the middle dividers. I cut this panel group to the dimensions of the largest panel, which happen to be the 2 sides, and after marking each of the panels on the actual surface, I carefully ripped along the diagonal dimensions.
Out of all the cuts on this entire project, this is probably the one that causes the most amount of stress because there's about a 14mm gap between the 2 sloped panels. So you have to make sure that when you're cutting this with your track saw that A, you have marked everything properly and that you're lined up properly with your track saw, else you're going to pretty much ruin the measurements for this whole panel.
After cutting the diagonal cuts, I can move the side panel groups to the MFT for final dimensioning. Next, I went back to the large panel group and cut the 2 thinner strips, which will later become the French cleats. To make this particular cut safer, I first cut the bevel edge, then I cut the panels separate from the main sheet. These bevel cuts can be somewhat challenging with a track saw when cutting from a small panel, and doing it this way makes the process much easier. The last cut group that needs dimensioning are for the top, bottom, and back panels. The top and back are initially cut from the same dimension, while the bottom is cut using the leftover material. After cutting the bulk material away, I dimensioned each piece to the specific dimensions outlined in my plan. After cutting each panel to its final dimensions, I used the opposite corner method to make sure that my panels were square. With this method, you measure the distances from opposite corners, and as long as both measurements match, your panel is in most cases quite square. With all my components square and properly dimensioned, it was time to apply the edge banding. With all my panels now square and dimensioned, it was time to mark the panels for assembly. To make panel marking easy, I use the shop-made jig, which makes identical marks at set measurements. If you want to make a jig like this, use the video links below and learn how I made mine. Before applying finish and assembling the carcass, I marked the inside of all the panels and drilled a 32mm offset holes. I use a shaper origin with a user-made template to route out the holes, which line up perfectly with the Festool SysAZ drawer pulls. After a dry fit and making some small dimensional adjustments, I applied 3 coats of Minuet's polyacrylic to each side. With the finish dry, it was time to glue up and assemble the carcass. Because of the overall size and with the odd diagonal lines, clamping can be somewhat of a challenge with this build. I used pocket holes to pull the panels together, and this helped keep a clean aesthetic when viewed from the front. And for the sides that would be hidden, like the bottom and back, I just drilled straight into the panels to secure the carcass together. After gluing and assembling the bench, it was time to mount it to the wall. Because I want the height to be exactly 900 millimeters, I held the French cleats in place with the bench upside down and measured from the bottom of the cleat to the top of the bench. With that measurement, I marked the wall from the top of the bench and then measured down to where the bottom of the French cleat needed to be placed. To secure the cleat to the concrete wall, I used 6 1/4-inch anchor fasteners. Once the cleat was installed, I mounted the SysBEnch, and then using a clamp, I pulled the bench in line with my other benches and then drove the screws through the sides to hold it in place. With the SysBEnch level and plane with my other benches, I drove screws through the back panel and into the bottom French cleat. With the SysBEnch installed, it was time to mount the SysAZ drawers and to finally store all of my Systainers.
So I absolutely love how this design turned out. I love being able to have the tools in the Systainers that I need most regularly. I've got them all lined up here in the very top. Tools that I have in Systainers that I don't need as often are underneath and at the very top of the stack. I love the amount of work surface that I have now on each one. I love the modularity of the design, so much so that you can see I've already built 3 and I plan to build a 4th one in the coming months. I love the angular design of the side panels here. Again, as I'm looking or as I'm standing at the workbench, I can't see the Systainers that are underneath, so I don't feel like I just have Systainers all over the place. It's so easy to just reach down, grab the tool that I need, and then push it back. I know that for some people that may seem like a lot more work to open the drawer, open the Systainer out, but for me, it works really well in my shop. Well, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch it. If you want to see more content like this, make sure that you subscribe to this channel. If you like the video, make sure you give it a like. If you want to build these for yourself, make sure you follow the links in the description below where you can purchase my detailed plans off my website. Until the next video, have a good day.